Welcome back, guys, to this channel. Today, I'm going to discuss about data types. And by definition, a data type is a set of values. And at the same time, these values share certain properties together. And these values also do have set of operations that can be performed on them. For example, there's this kind of data type called int here. Int for integer data type. So it allows you to store integer values in your program. And these values that you can store as integer can share certain properties together. And there are also certain types of operations then that can be performed on these integer values. For example, multiplication and or subtraction or division of the values, for example, in your program. And one thing also we need to know about data types is that data types are actually used when declaring a variable in your code. And so that means that its main function is to determine the type and the quantity of the value that your variable can actually hold in your program. In this video, I'm not going to talk about variables. I will do another video where I will talk about variables in much more details. We'll show you guys how to declare variables and also how to initialize them. And but what we need to remember about variables is that the variable is nothing but a reserved memory location that is used to store values in your program. So it's actually a container that will hold values during your program execution. And so as you can see on the screen, I have put some code here. So this is how you declare a variable. You know, in declaring a variable, we need a data type, and then we need an identifier. An identifier is actually a name that you give to your variable. So here, the ones we have in brown here, they represent the data type, and the one we have in yellow here, they represent the name that I have chosen to give to my variable. So that's the reason why I would like to make this video talk about data types in much more details, because when we're going to talk about variables, it's going to be much more understandable since we have already discussed about data types. So maybe you may be wondering why we have to know about data types or variables. Why are they important? And I think the main importance is because when you design a software or program, your main objective in designing that program is to be able to handle data, is to be able to manipulate information, manipulate data that will be inputted in your system. So different kinds of program will not manipulate the same kind of data. So, okay, so different programs will be manipulating different kind of data. For example, if you want to design a software that would help you calculate the salary of your employee, you know, some functions of that program will be, for example, to add and multiply numbers. So that will mean that the data that will be stored in your program will actually be numbers. They will not be letters, for example. The same thing, for example, if you want a system that would display the names of your employee, you know, the function or the kind of data that you will need in that program will be letters. You know, that will be a program that must be able to store the first name of your employee, their last name, and all these other information. So that's actually why it's important to know about data types, because it helps you actually know what kind of data type you want to use in your code based on the kind of application that you want to build. Okay, so that's really important. So let's just say that you won't be manipulating letters, for example, with a program, in a program that is designed to perform arithmetic calculation, for example. So that's actually the reason why in Java and some other programming languages, data are actually categorized into different types, and only certain operations can be performed on a particular type of data. So this may seem a little bit confusing, but with time, it's going to be just fine. So based on the data type of a certain variable that you declare in your code, the operating system will allocate the memory and decide what kind of data, what kind of values is going to be stored in that reserved memory. So data types allow you to store different kinds of values in your program, such as decimal numbers, characters, or integers, okay? And one other information that we need to understand is that there are two kinds of data types. There are the primitive data types and the non-primitive data type. So if you can see on the screen here, what I have highlighted is are the primitive data types. And down here, we have the non-primitive data type. So the non-primitive data types, we have the string, the arrays, the interface, and the class. So in this video, I'm basically going to talk about primitive data types. I'm going to focus on that. And in the coming videos, we will talk about in more details about the non-primitive data type. But just for information, I have mentioned these data types here. So let's start with the primitive data types. So the primitive data types are actually data types that are predefined in Java. Okay, so they are predefined, and so we use them when we want to, give a data type to a certain variable that we find is really important in our program. And in Java, there are 8 primitive data types. Okay, there are 8 primitive data types, and these are the ones that I have listed here. We have the byte, the short, we have the int data type, long data type, float, double, char for character, and Boolean data type. So let's start with the first one, a byte data type. So the byte data type is used to store numbers. So the values that can be stored in this data type are numbers. And so it's 1 byte, that is 8 bits data type. And the maximum value, the minimum value that can be stored in that data type is minus 128. So how you get that number is by putting -2 to the power of 7. Okay, -2 to the power of 7 gives you minus 128, and the maximum value is 127. So you get that value by putting 2 to the power 7. That gives you 128, and then you do -1, that gives you 127. So that means that any value that is beyond that range of values, from minus 128 to 127, any number that is beyond that range cannot be accepted, as a valid value inside that data type. Okay, because it's a 8 bits data type. And the default value for that data type is 0. So the same thing is for the short. Short here is also a data type that is used to store numbers, and it's a 2 bytes data type. So that means that it's a 16 bits data type, and its default value is also 0, and the minimum value that can be stored. So since it's a 2 byte or a 16 bits data type, so it can store more values than the byte data type, which is having just 8 bits, which is just an 8-bit data type. So the 16 bits stores much more values, and the minimum value that it can store is actually, you have to start by -2 to the power 15. So it gives you minus 32,768 to 32,767. So this is the range that it can store. So it follows the same principle. Okay, so you do -2 to the power. Here, the number of bits is 16, so you do to the power 16 minus 1, that gives you 15. And then the maximum value, you do 2 to the power 16 minus 1, that gives you 15. So it gives you 32,768, and that you remove 1, so you do -1, so that gives you 32,767. And as I said, the default value is 0. And for long as well, the default value is also 0. Now for integer, we have the int here. It's also used to store numbers. It's a 4 bytes data type, so that means it's 32. So you do 8 times 4, that gives you 32 bits. And it means that you will store much more values with int data type than the short or than more than the byte data type. Okay, so the maximum values you have, you do -2 to the power 31, and that's the minimum value, and then the maximum value you do 2 to the power 31, and then you do -1. So it stores a lot more values than the two data types that I have mentioned before. And after that, you have the long data type, which is also used to store numbers. And it's 8 bytes, that means 64 bits. So it stores 2 times the number of values that an int data type stores, because we have the 64 bits here as well. And it's used to store wider range of values. For example, if you have a very big number, for whatever reason that you want to store in your program that the int cannot store because it's out of its range, you definitely use the long data type. And just for information purpose, the int data type is actually the data type that is generally used as the default data type for storing numbers in your program. But for whatever reason, it may happen that you will use a long data type or the byte or the short data type, but the int is what is generally used if you want to store numbers in your program. And after the long, we have the float data type, which is used to store decimal numbers. So it's used to store decimal numbers, and it's a 4-byte data type. That means it's a 32 bits data type, and its default value is 0.0. So it's used to store decimal numbers. Okay. So, and then we also have the double. So it has the same properties. If the floating point numbers, the float here data type. So it's used to store decimal numbers, but the only difference is that it's an 8 bytes data type. That means it's a 64 bits data type. So it stores 2 times more values than the float that we saw here. And also, this data type is also it's the default type for decimal values. So in Java, by default, if you declare a decimal number, Java compiler will look at it as a double data type. Okay, so it's by default. When I'm going to show you how, when declaring variables and when initializing, how to make sure that if you want your data type to be a float, have a float data type and give you the result as a float data type, I'm going to show you how to initialize that in the next video. And after, we have the character, the char here. This is used to store character. This is used to store a character in your code. And it's a 16 bits data type as well. So it's used to store any character. That can be a number that you want to take as a character, or a letter that you want to take as a character. So you use this data type to store that. And last but not the least, we have the Boolean data type that is used to store true or false information. It's a 1-bit information, and there are only 2 possible values that you can store using this data type. So this is the true or false and the false values. Okay, are the only 2 possible values that you can store in the Boolean data type. So this is mostly used in conditional statements, in loops, for example, that we can use this data type. Even in methods, we will see when writing certain algorithms in methods, how we can use this Boolean data type. And the default value for this data type is false. Okay, so that means that if you don't precise or initialize that data type, so by default, Java compiler will look at it as having the value of false. So that's it concerning the primitive data types. So when we talk about non-primitive data types, like I said, non-primitive data types are different from primitive data types, okay? Because primitive data types are predefined by Java language, but the primitive data types are actually data types that are created by the programmer, the one writing the code, the one programming. And we have data types like the string, the arrays, the interface, and the class. So we will have in other videos where we will discuss about these data types. But here, just for as an example, I have declared a string data type here, a variable with a data type string, just for information. And also, what we also need to know about strings is that a string data type is used to store a sequence of characters, okay? And for example, a name is a sequence of characters because in a name you have sequence of letters, okay? So if you want to store a name of your employee, for example, in your program, you definitely need to use a string data type, to be able to store that. So it's used to store a sequence of characters. And in Java, a string um, is actually an object that represents a sequence of character, and so that object belongs to a class called java.long that string class. I'm going to talk about the string class in another video in much more details to explain that. But just for the information, that's what we need to remember about string class. Okay, so, and just briefly about the difference between primitive data types and non-primitive data types. The differences are the primitive data types are predefined, like I said, and the non-primitive data types are created by the programmer, and they are not defined by Java. So you, the programmer, will need to define them or create them. Another difference is that a primitive data type, they always have values. So like I was saying, that they have default values. For the numbers, the default values are zeros, for example, for the int, for the long, for the short, for the byte. For the Boolean, we could say that the default value was false. But for non-primitive data types, they can be null, if they are not initialized. So that's actually the difference. There's also that difference that we need to remember. And another difference is that a primitive data type starts with a lowercase letter. Okay, as you can see here, we have byte, short, int, long, float, double. They all start with a lowercase letter. But when we come to string here, and we will see also in coming videos, when you declare an array or an object from a class, you will see that we will have to start these data types with uppercase letters. So that's also the difference. So a primitive data type starts with a lowercase letter, and a non-primitive data type starts with an uppercase letter. And so the last difference is that the size of a primitive data type depends on the data type, okay? And while the non-primitive data types, all the non-primitive data types have the same size. So this is actually it concerning data types. I'm going to put some of these details in a description. So you can just have a look at it. And so let's meet in the next video where I will continue, but I will talk about how to declare these data types and also how to initialize them in much more details. And I will also talk about the types of variables that we can have in Java. So I hope this has been informative for you. And I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks.